I just want to tell you a quick story about something that I was contemplating recently, which is what life will be like in the year 2100. And I was thinking about this question. I've skipped over a bit, but we'll come back to that. Because I was reading this really interesting book by this guy, Professor Mark Maslin. So Professor Maslin is a really well-renowned climate scientist, which made what he had written down about what will come to pass in 2100 in two different scenarios particularly interesting because it was really well referenced. But the book, which I highly recommend you go out and buy, is only $10 as an ebook, and it's super easy to read. I read it in a weekend down south. But each little paragraph has a little reference on it, so you know that you can take it back to it being a scientific forecast rather than a dystopian vision of the future by a science fiction writer. And he lays out two scenarios. And the first scenario is the scenario if we don't get global warming under control. So if you're into your sci-fi, this is the Blade Runner scenario. This is where we have heat waves regularly above 40 degrees, and we already know what that feels like, with peaks over 50 degrees. We have agriculture being unsustainable in large parts of the world. We have sea level rises above 1 meter, and likely to head much higher because of the tipping points that we have passed. So that doesn't seem like a world that really any of us would want to occupy, or would want our children or our grandchildren to occupy. Unfortunately, there's an alternative, the second scenario which he lays out, which is really the Star Trek world. So this is the utopian vision, which is still within our grasp, of keeping global warming below an increase of 1.5 degrees. This is where we have cheap renewable electricity, which is available to all and used to power things like high-speed electric trains, which take us long distances across continents. This is the world which I want my children and grandchildren to live in. I'm sure you feel the same. And I think actually, absolutely everyone feels the same about that. So that leads to the core frustration for me around climate change, which is, why don't we just have the Star Trek world? Like, why aren't we doing everything we can to get to that one rather than ending up in the Blade Runner world? And of course, the answer is, it's a big and complicated problem. So if we look at the scale of the problem, some of you may know that emissions in 2020 were about 55 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. So look at that from the Australian perspective, we contributed about 520 million tons. So that doesn't sound like that much. That's only 1/100th of the overall problem. But then if you think about the size of our population, which I think is about 1/4 or 500th of the world's population, then you actually see that on a per capita and per household basis, we're at the top of a league table that you really don't want to be at the top of. And the complexity comes from the fact that those emissions are spread over a broad range of different sectors. So you've got industry, transport, manufacturing, agriculture. That is a lot of different things that you have to change in order to get to the point where you're starting to reduce emissions down to net zero. And we can think of this on a per household basis as well as on a country level. So if you take that 520 million, and then you divide it through by the number of households in Australia, you get to a figure of about 53 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. So we can say that we're each responsible for that in our household. Now that then means we can start thinking about what we can do as a household to get that number down. And of course, there's lots that we can do. We have technology now, so we can go and get solar panels. If we own our house, we can put those on our roof. We can start driving an electric vehicle powered by that renewable electricity, which we're generating. Might even go out and buy a battery as well, and I might fly less. But the bad news is, if you take all of those different things together, that actually only adds up to about 25% of that 53 tons overall. So we're about 12 tons on average of the overall problem associated with your household. But all is not lost, because there's actually still an awful lot we can do about the other 75% as well. So government action is important here, and of course, how we vote and how we apply pressure to governments matter. Money also talks. So what we do with our savings and our superannuation and the pressure that we put on companies there who operate in the other 75% can make a really big difference as well. And something that we talk an awful lot about in this group is the impact that we can have through the work that we do. And Jerome spoke really well on that last time. So those are all different ways in which we can have impact on that 75%. But there's one more, which is probably the most important in our day-to-day lives, which is making decisions about how much we consume and what we consume and where we get that from. And that impacts all sorts of different sectors. But agriculture I see as probably one of the most critical, because we make a decision every single day about what we choose to eat. So that's why I'm really excited to have David and Larissa here today to talk about two different sides of agriculture, on land and at sea, to help inspire us about how we can build a future for agriculture which is good not only for the planet, but also for our health and for the people involved in the agricultural industries as well.